we are part of the Go Mad campaign, which is Go Meet Your Deputy. And so you've got 27 organisations that we're representing. And some of the bigger ones are Compassion in World Farming, or Slow Food, Pesticide Action Network,
Yeah.
EU, Friends of the Earth, iFoam. You know iFoam? Yes. Yeah. Okay, so I am the daughter of a landowner, and so I was brought up with farms all around, and then I'm married to a landowner, and he's also farming. For the last 4 years, we've been making a film called Pig Business, which we're looking at the sort of intensification of agriculture, but we focus on the pig industry and the external costs of that industry. Alistair's a filmmaker and I'm a campaigner. And some of the external costs are animal welfare, antibiotic-resistant bacteria, the toxic cocktail coming from the biodegrading feces, which is affecting the workers and the people who live near these factory farms. Also, they're taking excess of the local water source for the pigs to drink and to clean out the sheds. They're also polluting the waterways, and they're dumping excess production onto third economies. So you have those subsidies which help them get a decent price with different value currencies. And also the soya, which is feeding those animals, is coming from Brazil, the Amazon rainforest, and Argentina. So the Cerrado forest, and so taking land from other people. So we're really here also, therefore, with the pig business concerns of the ComAgri cap amendments. And basically, we've read some of your background material, which says that we need to double food production. And we believe that this is a myth, that you need to double food production, and that we have enough food. We not only have it for the nearly 7 billion today, but for the 9 or even 12 billion. And the World Health Organization and the UN is to saying reduce our meat consumption, because not least because of the amount of crops which are used to feed those animals, which is 50% of all crops worldwide. So that's a problem, but also we have a problem with cheap food and the amount of waste. 50% apparently of the food produced is wasted due to our Western way of consuming, whether it be that the third countries producing the crops, it's not up to the supermarket standard, so there's a hell of a waste there. Then the waste from the supermarkets themselves as it goes past the sell-by date, then from your fridge, more waste, and the restaurants, and there's an enormous amount of waste. You've also got 1 billion people that are overweight or obese in the Western nations, and actually increasingly in the so-called third nations, and then you've got 1 billion people going to bed malnourished or actually starving. So the situation is the distribution, we believe. So now we'd like to start to ask you some questions. So can you tell us if you think that there should be transparency on all subsidy recipients and the amounts that they receive?
Yes, and I voted for that in committee.
Excellent, thank you. Okay, now the ComAgri recommends that anyone who waives the 30% of direct payments will be free to stick with their unsustainable status quo, recognising that cross-compliance directives must be obeyed, and still retain 70% of the direct payments, i.e. the subsidies. Or do you agree with us, where you'd like to see farmers do all the greening recommendations, which I will discuss one by one later on, in order to get any of the subsidy, i.e. mandatory greening to get direct subsidies in Pillar 1?
Well, I don't think it's such a simple choice between the two, because you're not, you know, it's a journey from a situation we have now to a change, and I don't think that you can achieve that by suddenly saying that there will be no support to European farmers outside of a greening package overnight. The 30% that's recommended currently in the package is the 30% for the next period of the Common Agricultural Policy, but of course it's part of a journey. So I absolutely don't think that you could move to 100% only farmers getting support for greening only, because it simply wouldn't work overnight. And you would have a situation where, like it or not, the produce of farmers does work within a global context, and if you suddenly removed any support in Europe, you would simply have prices increase, and you would then get floods of cheap imports from elsewhere. So it would just unbalance the market to an extent that would be unsustainable in just one move.
Okay, so if you didn't do it overnight, and it was an acceptance that to get the subsidy, you do need to have the following recommendations. Okay.
Well, maybe I should clarify that by saying that my ultimate position is that there should be no subsidy to farmers. I mean, that, I would be happy to be living in a Europe that didn't subsidise farmers with direct payments at all, and only gave farmers payments for public goods. That would be ideal, but that's not where we are. We're in the situation where half of our European budget goes on farming support of one kind or another, and it's a bit like an addict. You can't just withdraw. You can't go cold turkey. So I don't have a problem with it in principle at all, but I think it's oversimplified to say that you could move to there in this common agricultural reform, because I don't think you can.
But isn't this just a first move to get where your position is?
Well, in theory, the 30% greening would be a first move, yes. That you could see it that way, if that. But even if you, and then we have to come on to what the 30% greening means and whether that has any value at all. That's a different issue. But assuming that it has some value, then you're encouraging farmers to do something for the money that they get, environmentally something, because they would say they do a lot. They would say, well, we make food. That's something. But if you move away from just giving farmers money for growing food and you move towards public goods in terms of environment, fine. But yes, you do it gradually. So you could argue that the 30% is part of that gradual process.
But how do you get the farmers which are presently putting a lot of chemical fertiliser and pesticide into a position where they're not out-competed by other EU farmers that are putting those chemicals on the land, because all of them are required to actually obey quite stringent laws to try and get them off that addiction?
Yes, but that would... I wouldn't support mandatory organic farming. I'm clear about that. I don't support that. And that is the effect of what you're saying, is that you would be, in effect, penalising farmers who wouldn't go organic. Now, I'm perfectly happy with encouraging farmers to go organic, and there are, as you know, financial incentives to do so. But I don't support the idea that you simply say you cannot do that. That's against the law. You cannot farm your land that way if you choose to. So I sit in the middle of that argument, if you like.
Mm. But didn't you a minute ago say that you would like farmers to farm in a way which is mixed, well actually I think it's from reading one of your reports, which is more a biodiverse farming system, which surely when we go on to what the specifics are of the greening, that it would be whether we agree of whether that's how to, what you call organic, and which I would call just a progression.
When I say organic, I mean no pesticides. So no pesticides, no artificial fertilisers. And of course, in order to farm that way and to grow anything at all, you have to do your crop rotation and maybe lay down fixing crops, etc. That's part of that. But the essential elements of being organic, being no pesticides use, and if you're organic livestock, no antibiotic use, etc., etc. I wouldn't support the government saying you must do it that way.
But this is only a step, because the 100% greening before you get your 100% all of your subsidy is not saying no chemicals. It's just saying gradually come off the chemicals by, and I will go on to this, which is that if you have to have a rotation, and in that rotation it includes legumes, therefore the farmer is gradually building up the composition of the soil so that gradually he can unhook himself from that addiction.
If if that's what if that's where they ultimately want to go. But the point that you were making was that a farmer would be able to waive doing those green actions. So whether it's 30%, 60% or 100%, they can at any point make a choice that says, okay, I farm this land this way, I'm using X, Y and Z product, I want to continue doing that. You, government, taxpayer, can keep all of your money, I don't want it, I'm going to continue doing this. So the point I'm making is, no, I would not say, okay, we don't care what you want to do, you still have to forget the money, we're making you do this. That's my difference.
I mean, nowhere does the cap say that even the greening payments are contingent on a farm becoming organic. I mean, that isn't.
No, I didn't say they were, but
you know, it's not. It's outside
if the
the
greening
argument.
payments were, as you say, 100%. So at the moment, the proposal is that if you do these greening measures, you will stay in effect getting what you get now. If you don't do them, we'll take 30% away.
And can I just be very specific on something with that? Is I asked the local farmer why he was using neonicotinoids.
Mm-hmm.
And he said that we try to really minimise them, so we only spray at night. But we have to spray because everybody else is spraying, so the price of this crop is cheap because we're able to get more of it out of the land. Whereas if nobody was allowed to use neonicotinoids, then all of them would lose that percentage to the pests. So the price would be a level playing field across Europe. So what?
Yes, it would be, but what would the price be?
Well, the price would be our bees and our other insects' survival for the public good.
Okay, well, I mean, that's perhaps a good example where, you know, to expand the argument on, because if you're the farmer that's minimising his use of neonics, so he's spraying at night or he's spraying when the bees are not active, you know, doesn't always have to be at night, it can be before the plant flowers, etc. So he's reducing the impact on pollinating insects and he's getting a higher yield, which is what this is all about. It's increasing his yield. That's the competitive element. So those two things do not work against each other. Now, if he stops using neonicotinoids, and everybody does, and the yield drops on oilseed rape by 30%, in total, so there's 30% less in the market, then the price goes up.
Mm-hmm.
So the farmer, in theory, I take your argument, the farmer is getting the same net income for a lower yield. Possibly the case. But then who is paying the higher price?
The consumer.
Yeah.
But the consumer is saying, I would rather have a healthy environment.
In the question, was the consumer when the question was asked told that food prices would go up?
I think
when they answered the question, when WWF asked the question, are you prepared to pay 30-40% more for your food?
But what you've got is a situation where every market across the world is being flooded with products that come from farms that are economies of scale, where the currency is of a different value, so therefore the labour is cheaper, where the environmental laws are not enforced as stringently. And I've got exactly that in the pig industry, because they don't get the subsidies which the farmers get. So I can see exactly. And even David Cameron in my film was saying, just like we don't import cars that have higher emission standards than we allow in this country, nor should we import meat that has lower animal welfare standards. Now, in power, he's not doing that, because this neoliberal attitude that every single thing has to be to do with the market.
Well, you see, on that, in terms of importing into Europe, which is all I can talk about as a member of the European Parliament, importing into Europe meat that has been raised on lower standards, I completely agree with you. But that's nothing to do with CAP.
What CAP?
CAP doesn't deal with that. What I would like to see, and argue very strongly for, where we've done an animal welfare strategy from the Parliament, which has now gone to the Commission, and we're waiting for them to come back with a proper update of the animal welfare strategy. And a major part of that is we should not import into Europe any meat which has not been raised on the same standards as we currently insist on in Europe. Now, you and I might disagree on what those standards ought to be in Europe, but if we agree that we have standards, now the European Commission say to the Parliament, no, you can't do that because that's against WTO rules. And we say, sod WTO rules, we should be doing this, because what is the point of having rules? And if you can't do that, then you're in the position where if you're asking European farmers then to raise their standards, as I think you would like to do and I would probably like to do too, it's very difficult to do that when they come back to you and say, oh yeah, okay, so we'll put our standards up and then you'll import it from Thailand or wherever. We have to have that reassurance there for farmers that says, no, your market won't be flooded from outside Europe. And I accept that that will put the price of meat up in the UK, in Europe. I accept that. And I think, like you, that consumers will have to be part of that dialogue and maybe they will accept it. Yeah. So I don't disagree on that one, but that's not actually inherent in the CAP reform. That's my point.
Yeah. I think that basically where your argument with the WTO it's accurate, but I think there's also a problem within the EU, and that is that you've got countries like Romania and Poland where these very, very large-scale factory pig farms are going to take advantage of their cheaper labour and their lower enforcement regulations, and they're flooding into our markets. Yeah. So I think what we're trying to see with the Via Campesina and all of those NGOs that I mentioned and the public is to pay the farmer a proper price with the subsidy to actually do the public goods. So let's just go through these public goods. Okay. And I would like to sort of just bear in mind that the public is not unaware of a crisis that is basically reflected in the World Bank, for example, that reports globally that 5 to 10 million hectares of agricultural land are being lost annually to severe degradation. Also, the Commission points out that 45% of the European soils face problems of soil quality, evidenced by low levels of organic matter. In some countries, irrigation is increasingly being used to boost feed crop yields. However, in the medium term, irrigation leads to salination and hence to reduced soil fertility. So, now my question is, do you think that the farmers should rotate 3 different crops, including 1 year of legumes, to restore the nitrogen to the soil? And of course, in case the price of fertilizer, which it has gone up, I think it's 4 times in the last 20 years, but it will continue as you reach peak oil, etc. So this needs to be rotated over 3 years to ensure the breakup of monocultures. And this is the Environmental Committee saying that.
So you're saying, do I agree with the proposals in greening for 3 crop rotation? 3 crop rotation. Okay. My answer to that
including legumes.
Yes, my answer to that is in some circumstances. Soils and agricultural conditions across Europe vary hugely, from virtual tundra down to arid, salinated Mediterranean soils, and they have different requirements. So I completely agree with you that you want to reverse soil degradation across Europe, but I absolutely don't agree that a one-size-fits-all policy on crop rotation will do that. I think it has to be the tools for the job where it's happening. So I'm all in favour of a cap which pays farmers to do that soil improvement job, but I don't think this crude measure of 3 crop rotation across Europe is necessarily the right thing to do. I also think it has unintended consequences where you end up having, because this is all linked to the permanent pasture issue as well. So what you don't want to do is have where you've got farmers in the past who have, and take this as a very typical dairy farm in the southwest issue, where all they grow is grass for their cows, or they have a small amount, usually it's about 20%, which they would use for forage crop.
Mhm.
And that usually is forage maize, not always, but usually. To then rotate that with another crop and then a third crop, you would then be growing product that you are not using on your farm.
Mhm.
So you move away from being a self-contained farming unit, just growing forage crop and grass, into having to buy in from somebody else because your land is not suitable for growing that because it's sort of marginal height pasture land. So what you need to do in those circumstances is you need to have a proper plan for what would do, get the outcome that you would like to see, but on that land, which might be that you don't actually rotate that part of the land, which would be a small percentage. You use other parts, but you don't want to be digging up good permanent pasture to do it, to make that rotation work. So it's very hard to explain. It's very easy when you're on the farm, and I'm sure you understand what I mean. So what I'm saying is that there are lots of examples in Europe, hundreds of them, where actually you need to have a slightly more sophisticated approach than that, which is why I object to the sort of straightforward just 3 crop rotation. I think the principles of it absolutely fine. I mean, they're ancient farming principles that even the most modern high-tech farmer understands.
But doesn't do.
Sometimes doesn't do, but often does. Perhaps, and then then you've got to say, okay, well, what's right for this piece of land? So I would like to see something that's far more flexible in one way, in the sense that it allows you to make decisions that are right for the landscape, for the environment, for the climate, etc. that you're in. Not flexible in the sense you can do what you like, because if you're going to have public money, you can't do what you like, but flexible in terms of for the land. So I think we're kind of halfway there on that one.
Well, I certainly know farms that just do the monoculture year on, year on, year on, and they don't do
just grow wheat
the
on
legume.
the same ground year after year after year.
But they don't include the legumes, so they go on depending on chemicals, and it's an ignorance and it's a belief in chemicals and non-testing of the soil and just constantly increasing the amount of chemicals put on that soil. And to lift them out of that addiction, which is negative, I think they need to have pressure from the public to say, this is soil to feed us in the future. We live on an island. You can't do that. And I can't believe that there's not sensitivity, that if a farmer really can't do that within its system, and I still think that maize farmer that grows maize every single year on that 20% could be benefited by 1 year out of the 3 putting legumes on it, to put that nitrogen back, to get him off the addiction of the chemical fertiliser.
Yeah. All I'm saying is that in that circumstance, it might be 1 year out of 5, or it might be a 2-crop rotation. You see, in pasture where you're growing forage, 2-crop rotation works. That's more sensible. But 3-crop mandatory, that is more difficult. So it's too blunt an instrument. That's my view.
So basically, would you agree that you need to keep 7% of the land as ecological focus areas? I mean, no chemical fertiliser or pesticide farmed on that area. 7%.
Yes. So in effect, an ecological focus area would simply mean you put the land to one side, in effect.
Well, no, because you could put organic growing on that area, I think. Or grass. I mean, it doesn't have to be completely out of production, but it's not going to be doused with chemicals.
Well, again, to me, that's a blunt instrument. I don't see the value in having a set of rules that says 7% ecological focus, calling something an ecological focus area, where it may be the boggy end of a field or two that's never been very productive, and if that means you just don't plough it up, what's that going to do for the environment? It's not joined up to anywhere else. So there could be hundreds of hectares of monoculture in between it and the next ecological focus area. So any wildlife, pollinating insects, for example, would not be able to operate from one to the other. It's outside of their flying range, or where you would have small mammals that are not able, because they then have to go through vast amounts of crop, it's not a functionally big enough area for them. In other words, I think that all that will end up doing, a lot of farmers will simply not, they'll stop bothering to plough up the little bits that they know never made much anyway, and I don't see that there's any real huge net benefit. I much prefer the system that we have at the moment, where we have higher level schemes which take parts of a farmer's land and do very specific things with them for very specific gain, particularly on wildlife or birds, where you have headlands, feed headlands, etc., where you have bare patches in the middle of fields that are deliberately left there for skylarks, those sorts of things I'm all for, but just this sort of blunt ecological focus area, which actually will end up being the least productive, darkest corner of many farms, I'm not sure that what that's going to do, what that's intended to do for the environment.
Do you have to have one or other? Why don't you have, is it not both?
Well, 7% could be, it could be made up in any way under the proposal. It could be field margin, it could be field margin and hedgerow, which might be quite productive. I would prefer to see that, because at least then you've got corridors for biodiversity. You haven't just got sort of lumps. But it could just be, the odd corner. That, when the Commission first talked about greening, they talked about it as a way in which farmers could continue to receive public money, because it was no longer acceptable to the public that they received that for effectively just growing things. And I accept that logic. I don't, I do accept that logic. But I think they came up with the most crazy set of proposals to do that. I think they're, to be honest, unambitious, and I think they won't actually achieve what they want to achieve, and therefore the next set of reforms, you might have quite a big backlash of, there should be no greening payment at all, because these won't do what you want to do. And I was very disappointed right from the beginning that big NGOs said, great, let's have these, because they seem to me to be kind of, as I say, unambitious and not particularly innovative. There are other things that could have been done. I don't think these will work terribly well. But, that's just my point of view. It's not shared by many people.
But can I just ask you something? It's not being impertinent. I meant to ask you in the beginning when we told you of our farming background. And Dacian Charlos, as you know, is the farmer's son. He did work on organic fields. He is from Romania, which is a different country to the UK, and it has many, many more small-scale farms. And so his eye is on a protection of a small and medium-sized farm, whereas I sort of feel from the reading of an article and your letter to Stephanie Roth, was that there is a sort of an interest here of a sort of British farming reality of bigger farms. But we live in Europe, and we're also surely European in our desire perhaps to see not the demise of small-scale farms across Europe, to fit in with what we feel is fair on our rather bigger, more chemical-intensive farming systems. So I wonder, what is your background that you feel so strongly that it's wrong what the Commission has come up with?
I'm not quite sure what you mean by my
Well, I mean,
background.
are you
Do you
a
mean am I a
farmer?
farmer?
Yeah.
No.
And have you been working in farming for a very long time?
No, I don't work in farming at all.
No. So what is your sort of understanding that this is Dacian Charlos and the whole Commission, which surely deserves a degree of respect from our... Because there's a lot of MEPs that are following your vote, and they're not prepared to listen to another discussion. And so therefore we're kind of like really wondering what it is that makes you question what the Commission and the Environmental Commission is advocating.
Well, all I can really say to that is that even though I may not be a farmer, I'm afraid I think that's a positive advantage when it comes to European policy making, because if you there are too many farmers on the Agri Committee, there is a certain element of self-interest around all of this, which you can't accuse me of, because I'm not in receipt. I'm all for transparency. I'm not in receipt of public subsidy. Therefore, I have no axe to grind other than to say that the logical conclusions I have come to, and when all's said and done, I'm a British MEP, albeit I sit in a parliament that legislates for the whole of Europe. The logical conclusions I have come to is that I do not think that this particular way of going forward with the policy, this particular bunch of proposals, is by any means the best way to have gone. But that's the choice that the Commissioner made. Bans on hormones, plus the BSE, I don't think we should make the changes that the committee and I vote against them. The other issue is a very simple one on cross-compliance. Water Framework Directive is by definition countrywide, continent-wide, countrywide, down to river basin. Effectively, the Water Framework Directive you have to view in river basin terms. Individual farmers cannot be responsible for entire river basins. So how you can judge the Water Framework Directive on an individual farmer who happens to be in that river basin, I think that's actually just unfair. So you say, okay, you're farming in the Severn Valley, and this entire area there are some issues where it's not compliant with the Water Framework, therefore you lose your payment. You may be doing everything right as an individual farmer. So that's my objection to that. It's a simple one. It's not because I don't think the Water Framework Directive should be in place or anything else. It's simply that it's not a proportional place. It's the government that's responsible for that, not the farmer. The government is responsible for delivering the objectives of the Water Framework Directive, not the individual farmers. Yes, they have to do it through individual farmers and landowners, but if you could be doing everything to the book and you could lose your payment, which I don't think would be fair.
Well, I mean, I hear you, but I simply cannot believe that an individual farmer who's not polluting the river would be having to sacrifice his payment. And I think that what it is, and I work with the pig industry, which is responsible for an enormous amount of pollution all over Europe because of the effluent in their factory farms that they're getting away with. And therefore, if they were responsible and there wasn't the government coming in all the time and cleaning up the effluent, then that would be in the payment condition. And you get these, we've just been filming in East Germany and Latvia and Ukraine, and they are full-on polluting the rivers.
Yes, but under European legislation, there are measures that member state governments can take to enforce against polluting watercourses by a factory or a factory farm. And those measures may be proportionate. It may be proportionate to say, you have caused so much damage that you should get nothing in terms of your payment. But it's not the Water Framework Directive that does that. So it's inconsistent to say that they have to be compliant with the Water Framework Directive, because that is not, the outcome of that is not judged on a farm parcel basis. Effectively, if you leave the Water Framework Directive in there, then they are legally, you could say that each individual farmer is liable for the whole area. So it has to be deleted. That's why it's been deleted. Not because MEPs are saying we don't give a monkeys about the water. It's because it technically cannot work as being Water Framework Directive.
So you're saying it's misdrafted?
It's misdrafted,
right.
Yes, exactly.
Okay, so basically, would you agree that part of the greening, that the farmer must keep his meadows and pastures, and it must be on the farm base responsibility rather than the national base responsibility, which is what the ComAgri is saying, is that you can police it from the national base. Can you find it?
You're talking about the proportion of permanent pasture?
Yes, so keeping permanent pastures and meadows intact on the farm level. So it's farm responsibility. rather than what the Com-Agriculture, which is the areas of pastures and meadow, to maintain on the member state, the federal level. Because that would allow the farmers to plough them up.
Well, yeah. Doing it on a national level, which in the UK would mean England, because it's devolved, so doing it on the envelope of England, that would mean that the DEFRA would have the obligation to maintain levels across England of permanent pasture at this set level, and that individually farmers could move around parcels of land. So there's an element of flexibility in that, which if you freeze it at farm level, so you cannot move at all at farm level, then you're effectively sort of freezing in time what just happens to be now. So, you know, you take a snapshot now and it's frozen, you can't move from it, which may not be the best thing for that farm and that land and some of the, you know, environmental objectives that you have. So I think that would be, I think it's overly prescriptive. I think doing it at national level should work. I don't see why it wouldn't work, and it's much more manageable as an administrative burden for the member state.
But surely we want to freeze the last meadows and pastures in this country. I mean, why do you not want that?
Do you think there's a real lack of meadow and pasture?
Yeah.
Well, the southwest is full of pasture.
But long-standing pasture, it's just so different to, oh well, we'll let him kind of plough that up this year because he's got a bit of a problem because he overput. I mean, I'm going to be very negative, but you know, he's going bankrupt. I mean, partly he's going bankrupt because the Common Agricultural Policy is bankrupting farmers because it's so misguided throughout the years. Apparently, we've lost 1 in 4 farmers in the last CAP year, 2007 to 2013. So if that's not a clumsy system that is just exterminating our farmers, and to remain in business, he might say, I've just got to plough out my meadows and pastures. And actually you've got to say no. If you receive the grant, you can't. Well,
in effect, in order to do it on a national level, then each national government, or you know, it devolved, so in Germany each lander or whatever, would have to have control over what individuals farmers do. Because otherwise they can't control it on a national level. So they have to set up a system, and they already have it, as you know. They already know, they have mapped and know exactly what's going on in every field. They know what's pasture and what's not. So in order to get their payments, it's as easily done. What you want to do, which is preserve ancient pastures, is easily done if the obligation is at national or farm level. But if you make it at farm level, so somebody with 40 hectares, I mean, I went to a farm in Devon recently, which was about 40 hectares, so it's quite small in British terms, where they had decided that they wanted to go to a full mixed farming model. From what was beef pasture, they wanted to go to a full mixed farming model, which meant they planted some orchard, they planted small crop rotation systems, etc. Now, under the system that on a farm you couldn't change anything, they wouldn't be able to do that, would they? So, you know, you would be in the position where you would say, no, sorry, you can't do that here. You have to just keep, it's beef pasture, you have to keep it there.
But in a way, what the Common Agriculture does is almost make everybody do the same thing all over Europe. And you're actually saying that maybe everybody wants to go to a mixed farming system, so everybody's entitled to plough up all their meadow, and then you have no meadow left.
Well, it wouldn't happen, because you'd have it, if you have the obligation at a national level, then at that national level, it has to be, it's effectively bringing, it's just, at what point do you supervise that, at what point do you enforce it? And I think to do that to say, right, as of the day that the new Common Agricultural Policy comes into effect, it has to be frozen at farm level, is far too low a level and far too draconian a move. Do it at national level, and then you can at least make any kind of sensible adjustments that you might need to make.
Do you know something? I don't really feel adequately informed to tell you why this group of people who are very much supporting small-scale farming and ecologically benign farming systems have asked for this. But my experience from the pig industry is because at the national level it just doesn't happen. The nation just ignores. They don't enforce these laws. Maybe Britain they do. But there are so many farms in Poland, Romania, Latvia, Ukraine. They're just not obeying anything that we'd be made to obey here.
Yeah.
So I feel if there is one point, a centre that says, here, you've got a check here. Oh, you just ploughed up that meadow. You're not getting that check.
Okay.
I'm sorry.
Well, I don't entirely refute that point of view. I think there is, of course, an issue around enforcement. But, you know, then I have to say, well, okay, if there are issues in those countries and changes need to be made, we should address those issues. Actually making the sorts of changes that you're talking about in every one of the 27 member states to address a problem that exists in 10, say, it's a very European way of doing things, but it's not the right way, because you should be concentrating your efforts on dealing with those issues in those states. And one of the things which, as you know, has been a problem for the Common Agricultural Policy overall this time round has been the amount of money given to each member state. So, you know, the top level national envelope. And those Eastern European farms get far less on direct payments than, say, a French or even a British farmer. Far, far less than, say, a Greek farmer. And what this particular round of reforms is doing is not addressing that at all. So they're not putting more money into European agriculture to address the problems where they are. They are leaving it still short of funds compared to... So that in itself is exacerbating the situation that you're talking about, which is, you know, cut corners, cut costs, go for high intensity overnight. And I think, yes, that is a problem, but it's not a problem that's being addressed at all in this reform. So it makes it even harder to vote for this reform, even though, you know, there's some good things in there for you, but it makes it even harder for me to vote for it because I don't think that they're actually putting the money into where it's required. Although some of the countries that you mentioned do have higher levels of Pillar 2 payments. But the incentive for them to green in Pillar 1 is not there because their Pillar 1 payment is so low.
So unfair. So
I totally agree with you on that one. And I think it's a real shame that because of historical payment patterns, those issues are not addressed in this reform.
Is it historical payment patterns, or is it because their cost of living is less in those countries, so they think that they only need to pay them what they they need to afford?
Well, sure, that's how it started off, you know, when they came into the EU. It's all real relative terms quite recently. Clearly, payments were set lower because cost of living was lower, but didn't seem to take into account the fact that, of course, the whole point of those countries joining the EU was that they would, you know, wanted to get to the levels that Western Europe is at in terms of prosperity and I guess their sort of standard of living, and therefore there should have been an acknowledgement that if you're going to continue with the Common Agricultural Policy, their slice needed to increase.
Okay, well, this is being, I mean, what your concern is surely would be answered marginally by farmers that own only up to 50 hectares getting a premium on the payment of a direct subsidy from Pillar 1?
Yeah, that could work. The problem with that is that that's indiscriminate. So that's farmers, regardless of what they're doing on the land, getting a premium. And you can also argue that's double funding because they're already getting their payment based on their national. So I don't think that solves the problem.
But why? Because you've just talked about the fact that the new member states, which do have the smaller farmers very often, who are coming into off the land in droves because they're not being paid. Certainly what they were used to under communism, which at least they were paid farm gate price for their product. Now they have to compete with more subsidised Western farmers. So why not help them by giving them a premium up to 50 acres, 50 hectares?
Yeah, I'm slightly ambivalent on this one because I see some unintended consequences occurring out of it. I believe that will go through. So we will be able to judge. The best way of judging whether something works is to, do it and see. But I think there could be some rather, perhaps not quite so great unintended consequences on it. We'll see. I don't because I've got to be out by 3. But
okay. Do you think that giving some of the agricultural subsidies to insurance against risk is basically cannibalising money that should remain going to farmers, and it's actually instead going to the financial institution?
Yes, again, you see, this is one that's quite interesting. We could probably talk for another half an hour on this issue. I think if you put, there's a lot of money, as you know, being put in the policy to put in effect the ability to intervene when there are, for example, climate problems. So the ability to intervene by pushing up prices if there's floods or, And in some ways, I would actually rather see the money go towards insurance on that because it might be better spent. That might actually be better value for money than it is to sit the money in the Commission not being used, only being used at the point at which it's required, but only being used on a mechanism to push up prices. So if you have a crisis in the olive harvest, they have the ability under the rules to come in and sort of buy olives at a set price and hoard them. And this is where all the, remember the wine mountains and things came from in the past, and that we sort of moved away from that. And now there's things in this reform asking for that to come back a bit. Is that any better than actually saying to farmers, well, here we are, you could use some of this money to insure yourself against those losses so that there would then be no public input? Discuss. I don't have the answer to that one, but I don't see the insurance thing as perhaps being the answer, but I don't see that it's such a terrible idea to have a think about, because it only replaces money that comes from somewhere else. But at the moment, of course, in the proposal are both. That's not acceptable.
Do we need to get rid of the export refund instrument to prevent dumping the EU surpluses on third countries, which obviously undermine the third country producers?
Again, I think this is a very difficult one. With the system as it currently stands, I've met people who tell me that the system as it currently stands works well for third countries, for developing countries, and I've met people who say that it's causing huge problems. And it's one of those ones where I do not feel that I actually know the answer to whether that's good, bad or indifferent. Okay. So I'm not evading the question, I'm simply saying I actually find it quite a difficult one to answer, because the unintended consequences again of that are huge and spiralling.
Well, I mean, we implore you to say no to those export subsidies, because certainly from our experience with our pig situation and across the board, we're just flooding their markets with cheap produce.
Well,
And we don't want to do that because we've suffered from that ourselves.
my natural instinctive inclination is to support that, but I don't want to sit here and say I'm definitely going to do that, because I haven't really considered all of the issues, but I hear what you say.
Okay, and would you support monitoring the Common Agricultural Policy's impact on a long-term local food security in developing countries?
It's interesting, we were talking about the other day, and yes, in principle. In practice, quite what that means and how it would be done and how we would validate the data, of course. Again, it's a tricky one, but I'm happy to support that in principle.
Okay,
Yeah.
fantastic. And what would you think to basically having the ceiling for €100,000 check
Per
maximum to the individual farmers?
I think this is a very tricky one, because I understand why people think it's a good idea, because it works on the premise that if you are getting that much money, then clearly you don't need it, which is also interesting. However, if they're getting that much money and they're doing good things with it, then I don't have a problem with it. So if you limit the amount that a landowner, because often it's a landowner rather than the farmer, as you know, who picks up the check, if you limit the amount that they can have, you're also limiting the amount that they can have for agri-environment schemes. Is that a good thing? Because a lot of money gets spent across, for example, take somebody who gets a big check, Co-op farms. They get $2 million a year from Common Agricultural Policy. And I've been to some of their farms and they do wonderful things on agri-environment schemes. They do wonderful things in terms of community education, bringing children onto farms, and from places that never see an animal, they never see a field of wheat, they never see an orchard. Are we really saying that we don't think that that's public goods just because it's a large check? It's still proportionate to the land. So I think it's a bit of a heavy hammer to crack a nut. Ask me to sort of work towards something which would really satisfy my outcome, and I would say again, it would be the consistent reducing of Pillar 1, particularly over the years, but it has to be across Europe. I can't say to British farmers who I represent, I want to throw out all of your subsidy, but we're going to subsidise other parts of Europe. That's not what this is supposed to be a common agricultural policy. So whilst it exists, then I have to fight for that fairness for the farmers here.
But there is such fairness for British farmers in the Via Campesina agenda, because it's protecting the farmers by paying them a proper farm gate price for their produce, and letting that be the market that then decides what that price is. And it would be to shorten the distance between the producer and the consumer, so that the real expense of this farming system, where you've got eggs, dairy, meat, crisscrossing the globe, going exactly the same product to different countries. They're just, England is a fantastic example. Same amount of lamb coming in as going out, same amount of milk coming in as going out.
Well, that's obviously a huge agenda in terms of whether the global market is suitable for food, and of course there are some things it's suitable for. I can see a logic in you grow the things that work well in the climate and the soil conditions you have, and if you grow surplus, then it can go somewhere else. Okay, there's some logic in that. However, once you start doing that, say with an egg, chickens live everywhere. We've all travelled the world, and they're the basic component in any village you walk into on any continent is a chicken running around laying its eggs. So the idea that you need to carry eggs across vast areas, I completely agree with you, seems ludicrous to me. We can make all the eggs we want to eat here in the UK, and that's what I'd like to see happen, absolutely. But I can't grow oranges here.
No, I completely
and all
agree.
of those. So, and unfortunately, something like 40% of what we eat actually can no longer be grown here in the UK, as in we've changed our diet to the extent that we can no longer grow 40% of what we want to eat. And I think that's an issue that people have to address as well, is can you live, are we happy these days to live on a seasonal British diet, or do we have to have avocados and, perhaps beans from Kenya and things? And as an individual consumer, you can make those choices. I don't know about you, but I do. I don't buy vegetables flown in from Kenya. It's a choice that I personally make, and I wish everybody else would make it. Not because I don't want to help Kenyans, but because I enjoy eating my beans when I grow them in my garden in the summer. I don't necessarily enjoy them. They don't taste of anything. I don't want strawberries in December. They don't taste good.
Well, perhaps there should be some sort of level playing field between the advertisements from these huge retail outlets that are trying to persuade people to buy things which actually are not necessarily good for them and not actually what's written on the label.
Yeah.
And we should have the BBC and maybe the ITV with taxpayers' money going out there to explain why it's healthier to eat regional and reduce your meat intake.
I think those messages are going, people do have those messages, they hear them. They may choose to ignore them, and that's something which maybe this is, as a politician, I'm not unfamiliar with people saying one thing and doing something else. That's entirely consistent with human nature. So the current issues around the food chain for meat, and people saying to me all the time, I had no idea. At which point you have to say, well, what actually did you think you were eating when you paid £1 for 4 beef burgers? Because I don't eat those, do you?
Yeah, but you've got to remember...
But people are now getting that, they are getting that idea. I hope.
But you've got a relentless bombardment of advertising on people to eat crap. And you very rarely will you find them picking up the paper to find something which actually really explains what's in that paper. It's what's in that food. It's very easy to just, we've got a mortgage and the children have got to go on holiday, or whatever it is, and they just forget.
Yeah.
So I just feel, and also there is a supply issue which you spoke about, which at the moment, intrinsically, people are encouraged to produce as much as possible. For example, whereas it should be a limit to the amount you produce so that there isn't the excess that you then dump on another country and then get paid to dump it. So I think that it would be beneficial if there was more awareness of some of the campaigns from the NGOs that we're representing today, like Via Campesina's got 400 million members, and it's very, very sensitive to people who are living in the so-called third world, which is the 1 billion that go to bed malnourished or starving, compared to the sort of messages which you're getting in the West, which again, Via Campesina has got a space in the EU on those very important discussions. But it is a very, very good policy which would see more small-scale farmers survive in this rat race to the bottom of ever cheaper, where you have the NFU saying, we need to have a 2-ton pig. So in other words, they want us to grow that animal into a flipping hippopotamus. And they want 3 more piglets per year from an animal that's already been hybridized to produce 13 piglets. 2.5 times a year. We're going in the wrong direction because of this economies of scale growth. We need to take food out of the global economy.
Yeah, but it's a sort of basic human need to eat. It's the first thing that you have to do with your money, really. It's the first thing that you have to secure for your family is enough food to eat. And I think maybe some people have lost sight of that because actually they think the first thing they have to secure is an iPhone.
Yes, so actually every other component of our production system is undermined because it can come in cheaper from somewhere else where the labour is cheaper because we built the roads. So I think actually this so-called cheap food, it isn't cheap because it's been subsidised.
Yes, that's true, and that's something which people need to know, is the price of their food is subsidised, in effect, by the Common Agricultural Policy very heavily.